Hi, I'm Whole History Nerd, and welcome to another episode of the history of Cottingham. And this time we're going to be taking a look at the history of station mills. More importantly, what was here before station mills? When the railway first came to the village in the 1840s, it was presumed that freight would follow because freight always did. Whether it was agricultural freight like livestock and corn, or whether it was in industrial blossoming around the station, it usually did happen with railways. But Cottingham was quickly becoming home to a whole new middle class of people who had moved here away from the industrialised, noisy, smoggy city of Hull into the clean air of the countryside, and they did not want industry in their village. So there was strong resistance to any kind of industrial development of the railway sidings. Now, this was a movement that was accelerated enormously, ironically, by the railway itself, because it created a whole new class of commuters who moved to Cottingham to get away from the city. Well, had been once a lengthy and bumpy ride in a horse and carriage suddenly transformed into a 10-minute reliable commute that you could do day in, day out, rain or shine. So the voice of people speaking against industrialisation of Cottingham were very strong, and so this whole area was limited for quite some time.
In the 1850s, however, a new idea was thrown into the ring. For a long time, neighbouring towns and villages had had the benefits of gas lighting, both in the street and in the more well-to-do homes. Since the early 1800s, gas as a form of lighting had been gradually spreading from its birthplace in Salford over on the wrong side of the Pennines, where it had been adopted by early industrialists like George Lee. Hull and much of the nearby towns and villages had had gas lighting for several years now, but little old Cottingham was holding out. Up until now, it had been lit by oil lamps, which were, by comparison, dim and unreliable, so the fall of dusk in the village generally meant that it was bedtime, unless you were, say, an astronomer, or a burglar, or just like looking at the dark. Cottingham had a very vocal group of people on the vestry committee who considered the idea of gaslight to be an abomination, and many others that thought that the tax burden of the streetlights would be too great. Several people, however, were very unhappy at this decision, mostly the owners of the great houses of the village who would benefit greatly from lighting their homes with gas, and forced a referendum on the idea. And thus, the village voted to welcome in the Gaslight and Coke Company, who began construction of the village's gasworks, which opened in the winter of 1856.
The Victorians did love their grand opening ceremonies, and even something as prosaic as a gasworks was no exception. A brass band played, and the bells of St Mary's pealed out across the countryside in celebration of this new and wondrous event. And no doubt many of the locals will have looked on in wonder at the slowly rising and falling gasometers that would go up and down with the demand. And across the village, there would be streetlights starting to appear through the main streets: Holgate, King Street, George Street. There weren't many of them, and they were generally placed strategically at junctions, but it allowed the village to start to have something it had never had before: a nightlife. Well, I say a nightlife, I mean, granted, the lights all switched off at 10 p.m, so, you know, it's not the kind of all-night clubbing scene that we kind of know today. Much more a kind of, the pubs could stay open a little bit later.
The site of the gasworks was right next to the railway, just west of the crossing of Northgate and Inn Common Lane, these days more better known as New Village Road. The site was chosen for several reasons. Firstly, being next to the railway allowed for the steady supply of the coal that the gasworks needed to make gas. The railway itself had a third track in those days that functioned as a siding for the gasworks. Secondly, water is needed for the process of coaxing the gas out of the coal, and Craigbeck and the springs around provided a steady flow most of the year round. It's no coincidence that the land just to the south of the site was known as the Bogs and was well known for being almost permanently waterlogged. The land that they initially bought was originally considered to be on the small side, so just in case they needed to expand, they bought land on the other side of the railway, land which these days contains Exeter Street and a couple of the houses of New Village Road. The gas company, however, never needed to expand onto this land, and it was then sold to housing developers in 1893 to raise funds.
The great houses of Cottingham were naturally the first domestic gaslighting customers of the gas company, because they were the only people that could actually afford domestic gaslighting. It was horrendously expensive back in those days. But soon enough, several other main buildings throughout the village, including all the churches and the police station here on Finkel Street, got their own gaslighting. And it wasn't long before the shops also followed suit, each having their own gaslighted displays in order to better sell their wares after dark. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the streetlights were not like the streetlights of today. They were sparse, and in order to conserve gas, they would just have a number of them at important spots like junctions or crossroads. They weren't designed for pedestrians to create like a constant illuminated pathway. It was rather pools of light at important roadways connected by long stretches of darkness. Victorian Cottingham by night would have been a very dark place indeed.
But by the end of the 19th century, gas was being abandoned for lighting in favour of the far more versatile electricity, and the Gas and Coke Company sold the plant in the 1880s to a smaller local firm, the Cottingham Gas Company. And when British Gas bought the little Cottingham Company in 1902, it closed the plant entirely and instead laid a gas main from the Bankside Gasworks all the way to the village, selling the land that the gasworks had been on for development. Eventually, even Cottingham Station, which had hung on to its gas lamps long after the rest of the village had turned to electricity, finally switched to electric lighting. And this is where the station mills enter into the history of Cottingham.
So after the gasworks were decommissioned and dismantled, these buildings started to appear in the 1900s, built by local firm Paley & Donkin, who ran the site pretty much throughout the 20th century, and even now in the 21st still have an office here. This was a textile mill designed for the purpose of producing oilcloth, a kind of waterproof fabric like tarpaulin that was very popular in the days before plastic. But the replacement of the buildings of the old gasworks wasn't an instant thing, it was more of a gradual process. This building behind me was the first one to be constructed in the 1900s, but further along, other buildings were gradually added to the complex, including a sawmill. And that's when the gasometers, which were still standing for several years after the closure of the gasworks, were finally dismantled and built over.
The textile mill lasted for many years through the 20th century, but it didn't last forever, even though the company itself did, and the buildings have been home to a number of different businesses over the years, at one point even including a temporary cinema during the Second World War and a carpet factory. Interestingly, it appears that some of the newer buildings that were built on the remains of the gasometers, the big gas tanks, didn't just fill in the remains. One of the units today in use as a garage and an MOT centre has a very interesting basement.
So the inspiration for this video came in the form of an email from the chap who runs the MOT centre, and he said, I don't know if you'd be interested, but under our garage we've got the remains of one of the gas tanks. And that fascinated me because I assumed there was nothing left of the gasworks, and I presumed before I came here that what he meant was they'd had a cellar underneath it, incorporated maybe part of one of the walls. But no, what we have down here are two complete bases for both of the gasometers that were on the site, divided into 4 separate rooms with semicircular walls. And that's incredible because, like I said, I presume nothing remained, but to find both of these completely intact, just sitting underneath the structures above, is just incredible. Now, in terms of what these were for, you'll notice these are brick walls, and these would have been the foundations for the metal gasometer that would have sat above it. But brick isn't particularly good at resisting gas. It would have leaked out. So these were built to be filled with water all the way to the top. And the gas would come in through pipes and be piped up above the water level into the metal cylinders above. The water at the bottom would act as an airtight seal to stop the gas from reaching the brick layer and leaking out. And it's incredible because these were built on a pair of springs, a pair of natural springs. I don't know if you can hear in the background, but one of them's bubbling away even today and has to be constantly drained, otherwise it would carry on doing what this whole thing was designed to do and just fill all the way to the roof. In fact, in 2007, during the epic Cottingham floods, this was filled all the way to the top. The original staircase that had been put in when it was turned all into the station mills had actually come detached and was just floating behind the door. And even now it requires constant pumping to avoid it filling with water. The chap says I might need to bring wellies depending on how bad the weather was, but fortunately it's been dry for a little bit now and trainers have been quite sufficient. But yeah, this is brilliant. These are the kind of things that make me absolutely so excited to do this channel. I actually get to come and see something that I thought didn't even exist anymore. Like, this dates from the 1850s. It's 170 years old, and it's still here, underneath the station mills. Fantastic. Today, the station mills are busy, they're thriving, they're full of small businesses, from mechanics through printers to making terracotta pots. This whole area is still bristling with industry, all sitting on top of the old gasworks that still remain under some of the buildings.